much, Professor Josef Klafter, President of the University. Let me begin with saying a few words about the context of the prize and then present the format for this afternoon. Bioethics, as you all know, is a very, or I'd say relatively, new area of study and activity, which cannot be said to have existed in any form recognized today before the second half of the 20th century. In the decades since, bioethics has developed into an independent and exciting field of research. Alongside, it has come to occupy a central role in both science and society, and can and does function as both a gatekeeper and a facilitator of human progress. The Dan David Prize in Bioethics 2018 is the first ever major global prize for bioethics. The prize, in this sense, is an important milestone in the maturation of the field of bioethics. It is in this spirit, and with great honor and pleasure, that I would like to congratulate our three laureates, Professor Ezekiel Emanuel, Professor Jonathan Glover, and Baroness Mary Warnock. All three have made an original, distinctive, lasting, and valuable contribution to the field of bioethics as a field of study, in their scholarship and research. Equally, the laureates, each in her or his own way, have also contributed not only to the realm of ideas, but also to public engagement, policy making, and education. On Sunday, some of you were present, we had a very festive and quite impressive event awarding the prizes. Today, we would like to have a somewhat less formal discussion with the Dan David laureates. And the format that we have planned, as you have seen in the invitation, is by way of a conversation, which we thought would be conducive to this kind of discussion of questions that are of utmost importance, not only in research, but also to a wider public. I would like to thank my colleagues, Professor David Head, who had the wonderful idea of this format, and Professor Yael Hashiloni, who has graciously agreed to join this endeavor. This is also a good opportunity to thank the members of the review committee of the Dan David Prize, its chair, Professor John Harris, Professor Inez Befort, and Professor Thomasine Kushner. It was a great pleasure and honor to serve with them on the committee. Special gratitudes obviously go to the Dan David Prize, to Gabriela and Ariel David, and in memory of the inspiring legacy of Mr. Dan David, a great man indeed. And Ariel is here with us. Gabriela, I was told, could not join us because she is taking a class. She's a student in addition to everything else. And so she would not miss class even for an event as important as this. And as a university professor, I cherish that very much. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Smadal Schiffer. Where are you, Smadal? Fish, sorry. Yes, I said, oh, sorry, Smadal Fisher. It says, for all the wonderful work that she's put into this. I will present the laureates and their interlocutors in order of appearance and as we go along. So our first engagement is with the work of the Baroness Marie Warnock. Baroness Warnock is an English philosopher of morality, education, and mind, spent many years at Oxford. Baroness Warnock has had a leading role in the development of practical bioethics, specifically for her progressive and unparalleled contribution to the ethics of embryology and genetics and their ethical and philosophical implications, to reproductive technology and disability studies, among others. Mary Warnock has produced a stunning series of more than 13 monographs of the first quality over the past 55 years, from ethics since 1900s, published in 1960, through Women's Philosophers in 1986, Dishonest to God in 2010, and most recently, if I may say so, at the age of 91, Critical Reflections on Ownership. Her seminal and unparalleled achievements was highly known to not only to the experts in bioethics, but to a much broader audience. The Warnock Report on Human Fertilization and Embryology in 1984, which he chaired and guided through to legislation and adoption. This established a framework for a national consensus in the UK on embryo research and proposed a so-called 14-day rule for a permissible window of ethical embryo experimentation, and heralded the setting up of a permanent licensing and review body. This was a major breakthrough, not only in the UK, but really set an example of how to reach public consensus on highly controversial bioethical questions. It was not only the force of Baroness Warnock's rational advocacy, but her heroic consensus building, both in Parliament in the UK and society and globally, that has permanently changed both the face of science and the agenda of bioethics. And this is alongside with many more achievements in the field of philosophy, a bit about which we will soon hear. Discussing with Baroness Warnock is my dear friend and colleague, Professor Yael Hashiloni-Dolev from the Tel Aviv Yafo College, herself an expert and with path-breaking work in the field of sociology, of bioethics, and reproductive technologies. Thank you. Please.
Okay, now? Okay, so thank you again, Shai, Professor Lavi. I'm very grateful and honored for being here, especially with you, Baroness Mary Warnock. And I would like to first of all ask about the 14-day rule. One of the major achievements of the Warnock Committee was a rule which was endorsed globally that no embryo may be kept alive in a laboratory for more than 14 days. It has set a limit that most members of society were happy with, and within this limit, scientists were able to learn a lot. Recently, a debate has opened up concerning this rule, suggesting that the ban should be lifted. You said the choice of 14 days was somewhat arbitrary, but important to keep against the slippery slope. What are your thoughts concerning the recent debate?
Thank you for that question, because I think it's quite important.
Maybe it's not open.
Thank you. I believe that the 14-day rule was actually one of the most important things that made it possible for our report to be converted into law. I think if we hadn't had that limit on how long an embryo could be kept alive in the laboratory, we would never have got that bill through Parliament and the legislation wouldn't have existed. So I do regard it as one of the most important things. It was, to some extent, an arbitrary limit, but it followed more or less what we then knew about the development of the very early embryo in the uterus, because after 14 days, the development of the embryo becomes much more rapid. And after 14 days, there begins to develop a sort of plate of cells that adhere together quite closely. and which ultimately turn into the central nervous system. Before 14 days, there's no sign of a central nervous system, and therefore, of course, no sign of sentience in the embryo at all. So we learned a lot on the committee. In fact, I knew nothing about embryology at all when I took the chair on the first day. But we had a marvellous scientist who called Anne McLaren, who taught us, all the members of the committee, a great deal about the development of the embryo. And it became clear that after 14 days, when gradually the central nervous system begins to develop, only gradually after that, but development is fast after 14 days. So 14 days seemed like a good idea. And the thing that I insisted on was that it should be a number of days and not a stage of development of the embryo, because I could well imagine some scientists saying, well, my embryo is a slow developer and he hasn't got to this stage yet, so let's have a bit longer for him or her. But I wanted to avoid that at all costs, and I wanted certainty, because by then we knew that we were going to recommend legislation to ministers and not mere guidelines from the medical profession, but proper legislation. And therefore, the one thing that legislation requires is certainty. And I think everybody can count up to 14, and I think everybody can keep records of when the embryo actually was alive and fertilized. So there ought to have been, and was, I think, no doubt about when that stage of 14 days had been reached. So therefore it seemed uncontroversial and perfectly safe, in the sense that the embryo couldn't possibly suffer for quite a long time after 14 days. We were erring on the side of caution. And that was how the 14-day rule came into being. And as I say, I'm perfectly certain that we should have not have got the legislation through Parliament without that restrictive rule. And although one of the doctors who was the author, so to speak, of the first test tube baby, as they were called, was someone called Dr. Bob Edwards, who was a very brilliant but extremely incautious man. He, from the beginning, longed to have more than 14 days. Nevertheless, he was restrained by the law and he couldn't. So I was always thankful for that. So now the question has arisen of whether that limit ought to be restricted, ought to be extended. But the fact of the matter is that until 2013, no embryo had been kept alive in the laboratory for longer than 5 days, and the average time that an embryo had been kept alive was 3 days. So it was only in 2013 that someone managed to keep an embryo alive until 13 days when it had to be destroyed. And so we haven't had very long when that whole period between 5 days and 13 days has been exploited in research. And my opinion is actually that we ought to wait for a bit until quite a lot of more work has been done, observing and using embryos between 5 days and 13 days, because quite a lot can be discovered about embryonic development during that time. And my reason for saying that we should wait and not extend the limit yet, we may extend it later, is simply a pragmatic one. because I'm perfectly certain that if somebody now said we're going to have 21 days as the limit, say, or any number of days more than 14, the opposition party, which is very powerful to embryonic research at all, would marshal their forces and say, this is exactly what we foresaw. As soon as it became possible to keep an embryo alive for 14 days, look what's happened. They're going to extend it. This is what we thought all the time. And so they would put up a fight against this. And I have to say that in the UK, every time any amendment or change has been debated in Parliament, these forces of opposition have marshalled their forces and have been very powerful. And there is a number of opponents in Parliament, in both houses, and they would fight against any extension. And I think that, not looking too far into the future, there's a lot of work that embryologists can do on embryos up to 14 days that hasn't been possible before and is possible now. So that is my reason for opposing the change. I don't say forever, but for the time being.
I would like to ask now about women in science and policy. The Warnock report has been hailed as an exemplar of public engagement in science. You said that choosing a philosopher rather than a biology scientist to head the committee was a wise decision. Would you say that choosing a woman, if I'm not mistaken, mother of 5, to that position, dealing with issues of human fertilization and embryology, mattered no less?
Certainly not. No. I think it's possible that a woman might have more sympathy with women who are infertile. I think infertility is a terrible burden for those people who really want to start a family. And it's a particularly awful sort of burden because in most cases, people don't know that they're infertile. They have to wait month by month to prove that it is so. And it's a very harrowing situation. And it's possible that a woman in the chair might have more sympathy with that, but I doubt it, because I think all gynecologists, male or female, have great sympathy with women who want to start a family and can't. And so do the general public, especially people who rejoice in a family themselves, and they really do feel sorry for those people who want to do that and can't. So I don't think it really made any difference whether the chairman was a man or a woman. But I do repeat what I said, that I think it was a good thing that it was neither a lawyer nor any member of the medical profession, because I think that a philosopher is likely to be trusted to be impartial, because philosophers don't have any vested interest in any subject, really. You could say they didn't have any subject at all, but they are quite good at picking up the issues that arise out of other people's subjects. So I think philosopher was a good choice.
Okay. My next question is about religion. Your work in the United Kingdom bridged divides between scientists, politicians, clergy, and the general public. Israel declares itself to be a Jewish state, and indeed, bioethics here is highly informed by religious thinking. Could you share with us some tips for your enormous success in bridging bioethical divides between opponents, especially between religious leaders and scientists?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think I can give you any tips, because I was, on the whole, lucky. In one respect, I was lucky. There was a day when the then chief rabbi published an article in the Times after our report was published, which was headed Warnock Destroys Morality. That was a great source of pleasure to my husband. Because I was at the time a very rogue footballer called Warnock, who'd been expelled from his team and had left the country and so on. So the headline was quite interesting. But I was enormously helped, or the bill's passage through Parliament was enormously helped by the fact that the House of Lords, where the bill started, has, as you probably know, a representation of the Anglican Church and the bishops' bench. And there are bishops sitting in the House of Lords in rotation, but the two bishops who are there all the time are the two senior bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York. And the then Archbishop of York had started his career as a biologist. He had taught in Cambridge as a biologist, and he had changed careers when he was probably in his 40s. And he was at heart a biologist. And he gave a marvellous speech in the House of Lords, which I always remember, in which people were raising the question, when does life begin? And therefore, when ought we to respect life and not use embryos for experimentation? And he began his speech with the words, I am a biologist, and therefore I'm a gradualist. And I believe that the development of the embryo is a gradual process where we can choose when we respect it as we respect a child who has been born, and when we may use it experimentally. And those words were really very significantly important in getting the bill through. So I felt always hugely grateful to him, who became a great friend. But he, of course, didn't represent the whole of religious opinion. There were numerous people who were of the opinion that we were recommending that doctors play God and produce babies where babies were not meant to be produced, and so on. But on the whole, there is a hierarchy in the Church of England, and the archbishops, the two archbishops, Canterbury and York, are respected very much. And so the fact that this lapsed biologist was Archbishop of York, I think, had a huge effect on the Church as a whole, not just those bishops who were in Parliament, but on the Church of England, and not on the Roman Catholic Church, I may say, but on the Church of England and other non-Catholic Christian religions. But the Jewish faith never came along with us, and as I've said, I was accused by the chief rabbi of having destroyed morality, and he was very vocal. Then chief rabbi was a member of the House of Lords, and he was very vocal against the bill going through. So I can't give you any tips. I think you're up against it.
So maybe some tips about the next subject. The next subject is humanities and the social science crisis. In your work, you have engaged philosophy and the social sciences in public policy in a fascinating manner. It made philosophy practically relevant with its extraordinary contribution for supporting research while ensuring public accountability. However, today, I sadly observe that science, technology, and industry keep advancing rapidly, while the humanities, along with the social sciences, are going through a crisis of trust and popularity. Do you, first of all, share this observation? And if so, as a world leader in making our fields relevant, how do you understand this state of affairs? And do you have any thoughts regarding what can be done to make us more relevant?
Well, if I can answer your second question first, your last question first, I don't see any easy way, at any rate, of making the social sciences and the humanities more relevant, or I should say, more accurately, I don't see a way of making them seem to be more relevant, because in fact they are relevant. I don't believe that any society which over a long period of time starves the social sciences and the humanities of funding, which is at the root of the problem, that any society can call itself a civilized society. I do believe that it's completely necessary that we support and we financially support the humanities and the social sciences. Because if you reflect on what is studied in universities under those headings, and you imagine universities existing where those studies didn't exist at all, you would be faced with an extraordinarily diminished society. So I do believe that supporting and manifestly believing in the studies of the humanities is crucial to a civilized society. But I also think that at a purely practical level, it is enormously important that we have graduates who know how to express themselves, who know how to write, who know how to teach, who know how to be responsible journalists. And there is an enormous number of people, including civil servants and journalists above all, who really require this kind of education that universities can give in the humanities. So I think it's an incredibly short-sighted policy of governments, wherever they are, to starve the humanities and social sciences of money, and if in some sad cases leave them out of the universities altogether. I think it's a profound mistake.
Thank you. Could you share with us your experience of your own move from the very theoretical, philosophical work to becoming publicly engaged in more concrete matters?
That would be rather a long story. But I'll cut it short by saying that I was, first of all, approached by a politician, a Labour politician, who, when Labour was in power in the early 70s, to become a member of a body called the South East Economic Planning Council, of which I said yes, because I tend to say yes to anything, but I did say yes, because I quite wanted to get my foot into that kind of work. But it was an intensely boring occupation, that, because it was really a matter of people arguing about whether certain land that had been agricultural land in the southeast should be turned into building sites, and whether bits of the southeast should be amalgamated with other bits of the southeast. And people sat there saying, I've been an inhabitant of the Isle of Wight since I was a boy, and I'm man and boy, and I won't have it, and so on. And so there was a lot of infighting, and I quite soon resigned. But that was my first foot in this world. But once you have been asked to do something like that in the UK, your name goes onto a list referred to colloquially as the list of the great and the good, but in the civil service, known simply as the list. And once your name is on the list, you get considered for any job like chairmanship of a committee or membership of a committee. Because before chairing this committee, I'd already chaired another committee, and I'd also been a member of a committee concerned with the welfare of animals, which was a committee of the Home Office. Anyway, once you're on the list, you're always one of the people who are going to be considered. And so the way I got onto the list was being shoveled onto it by this Labour politician friend. And then I have certainly been inclined to accept any job that arose from my being on this list that has cropped up, because I greatly enjoy this kind of committee work.
In the early days, when the Warnock report was written, there were many worries that science is moving too fast, and it was hard to distinguish between pure science fiction and the real science of the time. More than 30 years later, having your special experience and looking at new technologies such as gene editing, cheap whole genome sequencing, and the like, are you still confident human society can wisely control its growing abilities as before, or are you somewhat worried?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think there are people, though possibly fewer than there were, who tend to think that science is moving too fast, and that both ordinary people and people who interest themselves in morals and moral philosophy are struggling to catch up with them. And people started saying that sort of thing, I should think, in the 1960s, certainly in the early 70s, they were busy saying it. And I've never quite known what people think the remedy is. I mean, let's say for a moment that it's true that science moves faster than either ordinary people or moral philosophers can catch up with them, and it's difficult to see the consequences. And I think that Jonathan Glover can tell us a great deal more about that, about the necessity and the wisdom of looking into the future and really thinking seriously about what our attitudes to possible future development will be. And I don't think we're very good at that. Certainly in the case of embryology, most people didn't know what work was going on in embryology. Only gynecologists and embryologists really knew what was going on. But of course, a lot of work had been going on working with early embryos, not in the laboratory because they didn't exist, but with embryos that had been aborted by ill chance, and with other materials, and working as far as they could with pregnant women. A lot of work had been going on, and a lot of time had been taken in trying to produce an embryo, trying to produce a fertile egg in the laboratory before the first test tube baby was actually born, so to speak, that the fertilization actually occurred in the laboratory, and then the embryo was implanted in the uterus. So a great deal of work had gone before And when the first baby was born that way, the first in the world, in Stockport in north of England, really nobody quite knew what to do, because they suddenly, at that point in 1978, saw that this was going to be a huge development in the future, that it was bound to be replicated, and there was going to be a whole problem. So that was when the government decided, I think properly, that they wanted a committee set up, because no minister of health could rely on his civil servants to provide the evidence and the facts, and above all the evidence from all kinds of people that was required to make a proper legislative decision. So I think that was certainly a case where it was very right to have a committee. But I think it's still true that we're not as good as we should be at considering possible future developments. Because people, the general public and Parliament, feel they've got enough on their plate with things that are actually happening without fussing about what might happen in the future. So I think that actually we ought to get better at it, and we ought to set up possibly as a standing Royal Commission or standing committee that took on considering developments, likely developments in different bioethical fields, or fields that were likely to become a matter of ethics in the biological sciences. I believe that that would be a good and sensible thing. There is a standing Royal Commission in the UK on environmental matters. There could be a standing Royal Commission on this kind of bioethical subject. The only thing is that since the days of Margaret Thatcher, the whole concept of a Royal Commission of any kind, it has gone out of favour. So it would be quite difficult to achieve a standing Royal Commission. But that, I think, is something that ought to be done, because it would help people, newspaper readers and people who are interested in the sciences, and particularly people who are interested in the practical application of the sciences. It would help them to know what was going on if there were, say, a 6-monthly report from this committee, simply to keep the ordinary public up through journalism with what was actually happening. And we have in the UK, and I'm sure you have here, a great number of really responsible scientific journalists who know what they're talking about and take trouble not to exaggerate, not to distort, but actually to get things right. So we could rely on journalists to keep people up to date if we had this kind of commission.
I think this is a wonderful idea, and it has actually answered my next question. And it reminds me that it might be time to mention that here in Israel, we don't even have a National Bioethics Committee anymore. We used to have one, and I was a member of it, but for the last 2 years, it's not meeting anymore. So maybe it should start meeting again, and maybe we could also use your idea. I'm approaching my last questions. Would you like to see a sort of a global committee or a Warnock report, or should different societies have some autonomy regarding regulation?
I don't think there's any case for a global report or a global committee. I mean, one of the reasons for this is that, as you said, as one of our discussions entailed, religion does play an enormous part, and in some societies a greater part than in others. And a global committee would, in a way, be forced to take seriously religious concerns which in their own country weren't particularly important or could be got over or got round, or one could make friends with religious people, as we indeed did, up to a point, but only up to a point. But I can imagine many societies where this would be completely impossible. And I think, therefore, the work of such a committee could not go at all smoothly if it represented more than one country at a time. Besides, I feel that these moral questions, ethical questions of this kind, in a democracy, they deserve their own legislation, because I think that, well, my most general observation is that civilized society depends, above all other things, on the rule of law and the confidence that people can have within that society on the rule of law. But I also believe that each society must make its own law, and therefore I think it would be inappropriate to try to have some sort of rather vague international law that covered all societies. I don't think it would be appropriate, I don't think it would work, and I don't think it would actually win the support of the people who were supposed to govern.
Do you have any lessons or regrets you would like to share for the future?
Well, I have to answer this question by contrasting it with another government committee of inquiry that I chaired before the Embryology Committee, and that was a committee that was looking into the education of what was then called handicapped children, children with special needs. And that committee of inquiry lasted for 4 years. The committee met for 4 years. And we had people who were knowledgeable and expert in nearly all, certainly all the common disabilities that children may suffer. And we were a very amicable committee. We weren't ever at odds with one another, as the Embryology Committee were often at odds with one another. But because we all had the same aim, which was to improve the educational possibilities for children who suffered from various kinds of disabilities. But looking back on the report, the first Warnock report on special educational needs, I did fairly soon, and certainly now, think that we made grave errors, really grave errors, and also that all of the things we suggested and all of the things that were implemented cost far more money than we had foreseen, and therefore local authorities and the Department for Education simply didn't implement some of the things we recommended because it was too expensive. So I look back on that and I think I didn't do that terribly well. I made mistakes which I didn't foresee, where I didn't foresee the consequences of what we were doing, and anyway, we didn't get the money that we needed, so to speak. So in contrast with that experience, I have to say that I don't have the same regrets about the Embryology Committee. I can't say I really wish we hadn't recommended that because it's been disastrous. I know there are some people, and some of my colleagues in the House of Lords, who think that we were unduly restrictive and that much more could have happened since in the way of genetic work, genetic engineering, and in all the kinds of other ways. They think that we were too restrictive, and they've been inhibited, they feel, since the report came out. But I don't actually, I'm afraid, share this view, and I think that may sound terribly arrogant, but I do believe that we did get it more or less right. And what the most important thing is, going right back to the beginning of our conversation, the 14-day rule. If that hadn't been introduced, then there wouldn't have been any of the developments that there have been. And so, by and large, I think I don't regret that. I certainly don't regret setting up the authority, the Human Fertilization Authority, which has done a tremendous job in overseeing changes, in monitoring performance in all clinics and hospitals, both privately funded and public National Health Service clinics. So that, I think, was a move that was necessary. Indeed, it was our very first recommendation on our list of recommendations, that there should be a monitoring and continuously existing committee looking into possible infringements of the law. That, I think, was quite important. So I end on this rather optimistic note that I think things are going both fast and well and for common good in the field of bioethics that we are interested in.